He gave them water. They returned with an army, not for war but for honor. The twin suns of the planet Zakar beat down mercilessly on the barren desert. The land stretched out in every direction, a harsh, dry landscape that seemed to have little mercy for anyone unlucky enough to be caught in its grasp. Ryder Hawk, a lone rancher, was used to the isolation. He had lived on this desert planet for many years, a quiet life far from the noise of cities and the politics of distant governments. His ranch was small but self-sufficient until the water started running low. His land, once green with the promise of life, had turned dry. His cattle, loyal as always, struggled under the unrelenting sun. Ryder had always prided himself on being able to take care of himself, to provide for his herd, but as the drought dragged on, it became harder and harder to keep things going. On this particular morning, Ryder woke early, as he always did. He stepped out of his small, weather-worn house and looked across the vast expanse of his ranch. The wind stirred the dust, carrying with it the smell of earth baked by the heat. His well had nearly dried up, and there was only a small tank of water left. He couldn't afford to waste any. The last thing he needed was to run out completely. As he worked his way through the chores, his mind kept returning to the same thought. He had to find water. It was a matter of survival, not just for him, but for his cattle too. Ryder didn't mind the loneliness of living on a remote ranch. He had always been a man who preferred solitude. But it was in times like this, when everything seemed so uncertain, that the silence of the desert felt more like an enemy than a companion. Around midday, as Ryder worked to mend a broken fence near the edge of his ranch, he spotted something unusual on the horizon. At first he thought it was a mirage, the heat playing tricks on his eyes, but as he squinted against the bright sun, he could make out the figures of several people, a small group, stumbling slowly across the dusty plains. They were far off, but they didn't look like any travelers he had seen before. They didn't ride horses or any other kind of vehicle. Instead, they walked with a slow, labored gait, and it was clear they were struggling. Ryder's heart skipped a beat. Strangers. In all his years on Zakar, he hadn't seen anyone other than the occasional wanderer passing through. It was rare to find anyone out here, especially in the desert's deadly heat. He quickly grabbed his water canteen and made his way toward them, moving as fast as the desert heat would allow. As he drew closer, he could see that there were 4 people, 3 men and 1 woman. Their clothes were torn and caked with dust, and their faces were gaunt with thirst and hunger. The woman in the group appeared to be the weakest, her steps slow and shaky. Ryder's instincts kicked in. He had been raised to never turn away anyone in need, especially in a place like this. He approached cautiously, keeping his distance but making sure they saw him. When the group noticed him, they stopped in their tracks, eyeing him with suspicion. Ryder raised his hand in a gesture of peace. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said in his gravelly voice. "You folks need water?" The woman, her face pale and sunken, nodded weakly. Her eyes flickered with a mix of gratitude and desperation. We've been walking for days," she said, her voice faint. "We've run out of water. Please, just a little. We're so thirsty." Ryder didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, opening his canteen and handing it to the woman. She took it gratefully, gulping down the water with desperate speed. Ryder watched her for a moment, noting the way she trembled as she drank, as if the water was the only thing keeping her from collapsing entirely. The other men in the group watched him carefully, their eyes hard but with a glimmer of thanks. Ryder knew better than to ask too many questions at first. The desert had a way of changing people, and he didn't need to know their story to understand their need. "Where are you folks headed?" Ryder asked, his voice low. The woman paused for a moment after taking another swig of water, then looked at him with eyes full of weariness. "We were trying to reach the Sethorian tribes," she explained, "but we've been lost for too long." Ryder nodded. The Sethorians were a nomadic tribe that lived further east. He had heard of them but never met them. The desert was tough, even for the hardened Sethorians, but if they could make it, they might find shelter with their people. "Well," Ryder said after a moment, "you've got a long way to go. You're welcome to stay here for a bit. I've got a place for you to rest, and we can figure out what to do next." The woman's face softened, and she seemed to stand a little taller with the offer. Her companions too nodded in silent thanks. Ryder led them to his small home where they could get out of the heat and rest. He gave them some food, dried meat and simple bread, and let them stay in the cool shade of his porch while he worked on a few tasks around the ranch. The hours passed slowly, the sun crawling across the sky, and as the evening settled in, the group seemed to regain some of their strength. Around sunset, the woman came to him again. She was standing at the edge of the porch, looking out toward the horizon. Her dark hair was tied back and her eyes had a determined glint in them now. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger now. "You didn't have to help us. Most wouldn't. Most would have just let us die out there." Ryder shrugged. "I wasn't going to leave you folks to die. The desert doesn't take kindly to the weak, but that doesn't mean you just give up." The woman studied him for a long moment, and Ryder could feel the weight of her gaze. She seemed to be sizing him up, as if trying to figure out what kind of man he was. "You're different," she said at last. "Not many men would do what you did today. My people, we call that kind of man a warrior. You may not think of yourself that way, but you gave us your water, and with it you gave us hope." Ryder felt a strange warmth in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe it was the desert air, or maybe it was something else, but for the first time in days, he felt like his choice had meant something. As night fell over the desert, Ryder sat by the fire, looking out at the stars. The world seemed vast, but in that moment it didn't feel so lonely. The days that followed were quiet on Ryder's ranch. The dust from the desert winds had settled, and a peaceful calm hung in the air. Ryder continued his daily routines, working on repairs to the fence and checking on his herd. His guests, the group of strangers he had helped, had recovered well. The woman, whose name was Kara, and her companions, 2 men named Jarek and Davin, had rested and regained their strength. They were thankful for Ryder's kindness, but they hadn't said much about why they were in the desert or what they were truly looking for. Each evening, after a long day's work, they would sit around the fire, sharing a simple meal. Kara, though quiet, seemed to appreciate the small moments of peace. Ryder couldn't help but notice how her gaze would drift out toward the horizon, as if she were watching for something, or someone. On the 4th night, just as Ryder was finishing up with the cattle, he noticed a dust storm beginning to form in the distance. It was a common sight on Zacher, but this one seemed different. The wind picked up speed and dark clouds swirled over the horizon. Ryder felt a chill crawl down his spine. Something wasn't right. By the time the sun had fully set, the storm had grown stronger. The wind howled across the land, kicking up dust and making it difficult to see more than a few feet in front of him. Ryder made his way back to the house quickly, closing the door behind him and securing the windows as best as he could. Inside, the warmth of the fire flickered as he sat down to a meal. Kara, Jarek, and Davin were already there, their faces tense as they watched the storm rage outside. Kara's eyes were focused, as if she were expecting something. Ryder could feel the unease in the air, and his instincts told him this storm wasn't just another shift in the weather. "There's something wrong," Kara finally said, her voice low but urgent. "They're coming." "Who's coming?" Ryder asked, his voice steady despite the unease growing in his chest. Kara stood, pacing slightly as she spoke. "My people. The Sithorians. They'll be here soon, Ryder." Ryder raised an eyebrow. "You said you were trying to reach them, but you didn't say anything about them coming to you." Kara stopped pacing and looked at him, her expression serious. "I didn't want to get your hopes up, but after what you did for us, after the water you gave us, they'll come. The Sithorians don't forget a debt like that. We don't forget those who show us kindness." Ryder stood up and walked over to the window. The storm outside continued to rage, but he could see shapes moving through the haze, figures riding on horseback. The wind seemed to whisper in strange, almost foreign tones, and Ryder's heart pounded in his chest. He turned to Kara. "How many of them are out there?" Kara's voice was calm but full of tension. "I don't know. But the Sithorians are a proud people. They don't come for war, but for honor. They owe you their lives." Ryder shook his head, unsure what to make of all this. He had helped these people out of the goodness of his heart, but now it seemed like he was caught in the middle of something much bigger. He had never asked for any kind of repayment, never expected anything more than a simple thank you. But now, it seemed he was about to get far more than he bargained for. "They don't owe me anything," Ryder muttered. "I just gave them water." Kara's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his arm. "In the Sithorian way, you gave them more than water, Ryder. You gave them hope, and hope is worth far more than any coin or riches." Ryder stared out the window, watching as the figures in the storm drew closer. He knew this could change everything for him. His peaceful, solitary life was about to be interrupted, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what was coming. Just then, a loud knock echoed through the house, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Ryder turned, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle, but Kara held up a hand. "It's them," she said quietly. "They've come." Ryder hesitated for only a moment before he moved to the door. He opened it slowly, revealing a large group of Sethorians standing outside, their cloaks swirling in the wind. At their front was Dahar, the leader of the group, his face marked by time and experience. He was a tall, imposing figure, with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of countless battles and journeys. "I knew you would come," Kara said, stepping forward to greet him. "You've kept your word." Dahar nodded, his gaze shifting to Ryder. He spoke in a deep, steady voice, the words carrying a sense of respect. "You have shown great honor, Earthman. The Sethorians do not forget such acts. You saved one of our own, and for that we owe you a debt. We have come to offer our protection." His mind raced as he tried to process the situation. He had expected a simple thank you, not an entire army showing up at his doorstep. "I didn't ask for this," Ryder said, his voice steady but laced with confusion. "I didn't want anything from you." Dahar's eyes softened slightly. "But in the ways of the Sethorians, an act of kindness is never left unanswered. You will have our protection, for as long as you need it." Ryder stood in silence, the weight of the words settling in. His ranch, his quiet, solitary life, was about to be transformed. He had no idea what the future would hold, but one thing was clear. The Sethorians were a powerful and honorable people, and he was now bound to them in a way he could never have imagined. The storm raged on outside, but inside the warmth of the fire seemed to grow stronger. Kara, Jarek, and Davin stood quietly behind Ryder, watching the exchange with silent respect. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Ryder felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't alone anymore, and somehow that felt right. As the Sethorians set up camp outside, preparing for the storm to pass, Ryder turned back to Kara. "What happens now?" he asked. Kara smiled softly, her eyes full of gratitude. "Now, Ryder, you have allies, and the world will be a little less lonely." Ryder nodded slowly, still processing it all. The desert had always been a place of solitude, but now, with the Sethorians at his side, it felt like the beginning of something much bigger. The days following the arrival of the Sethorians were full of tension and change. Ryder could feel the shift in the air. What had once been a quiet, solitary existence on his ranch now felt like the calm before a storm. The Sethorians, led by Dahar, had set up camp outside, just beyond the range of Ryder's house. They moved with the precision of soldiers, but with the pride of a people who valued honor above all else. The storm had passed, but a different kind of pressure seemed to hang over Ryder's homestead now. The Sethorians had offered their protection, but Ryder wasn't sure what that meant for him. He had never wanted an army, and he certainly didn't want to be caught up in a larger conflict. Still, the look in Dahar's eyes when he spoke about honor made it clear that they weren't going anywhere anytime soon. Each day, Ryder would go about his chores, tending to the cattle, fixing fences, and working on whatever needed doing around the ranch. But now, the Sethorians watched him closely, their eyes always alert, always measuring. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was a reminder that his life had changed. Kara, Jarek, and Davin had been helpful around the ranch, always ready to lend a hand when needed, but even they seemed uneasy, caught between their gratitude for Ryder's help and the sense of responsibility they now felt to the Sethorians. Ryder had never been one for large groups or crowds, and the constant presence of the Sethorians began to weigh on him. He had lived alone for so long that the idea of sharing his space, even with people who meant no harm, felt like a burden. But Kara had reassured him. "They're here because of what you did," she said one evening as they sat by the fire. "They came to honor you, Ryder. The Sethorians don't act without reason. When they offer protection, they mean it." Ryder nodded, but the weight of the situation pressed on him. He had never asked for anything more than a quiet life. Now, it seemed, the desert had thrust him into a story much larger than he had ever expected. Days turned into weeks, and life went on. Ryder kept working, and the Sethorians remained camped outside. Their presence was undeniable, but they had made no moves beyond what Ryder had already seen. No attacks, no demands. They simply watched, always ready to defend him if needed. But Ryder couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would force him to make a choice. He had helped the Sethorians when they needed it, but now they were the ones offering their help. He didn't know what kind of help that would be, or if it would come with a price. It wasn't long before the tension Ryder had been feeling began to manifest in strange ways. His nights were restless, filled with dreams of distant battles and of shadows moving across the desert. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart pounding in his chest, and every time he closed his eyes he saw the same image, a figure standing in the distance, watching him. One evening, as Ryder returned from a long day of work, he noticed something different. The air felt heavier than usual, the sky a strange shade of red. The wind had picked up, and the dust was swirling in strange patterns. He could hear the distant hum of machines, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Ryder paused, his senses on high alert. Something wasn't right. He turned to look back toward the Sithorian camp, but he saw no signs of movement. Dahar, Jarek, and the others were all standing still, watching the horizon. They were waiting for something, just like Ryder. Kara approached him, her face tense. "They're coming," she said simply. "Who's coming?" Ryder asked, his voice low and filled with unease. "The raiders?" Kara replied. "We've been hearing rumors of their movement in the desert. They've been getting bolder lately, and now they know we're here." Ryder's blood ran cold. The raiders were a lawless group, scavengers who lived off the land and took what they wanted by force. They had never been a serious threat to Ryder before, but now, with the Sithorians on his land, the situation had changed. If the raiders came, they wouldn't care about honor or kindness. They would take everything Ryder had, and more. "They'll be here soon," Kara said, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "And when they come, they won't be asking questions. They'll take what they want, and they won't leave until they do." Ryder turned back to the horizon, the distant hum of machines growing louder. He could see the figures now, moving toward him with purpose. A dozen or more raiders on horseback, riding fast, their weapons glinting in the dying light of the day. They were coming. Ryder felt the weight of the situation sink in. He had no idea how to face the raiders. He had never been a fighter, and even with the Sithorians at his side, he wasn't sure how much good they would do. The raiders were ruthless, and they didn't care who they hurt to get what they wanted. Dahar walked up to Ryder, his expression calm but filled with resolve. "We will stand with you," he said simply. "The raiders will not take what is yours." "Not while we are here." Ryder looked at him, still unsure. "What if we can't stop them?" Dahar's eyes were unwavering. "We will stop them, Ryder. We stand for honor, and for that, we will fight." Ryder nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief. The Sithorians were fierce warriors, and their loyalty to him was clear. But he also knew that this was no longer just about him or his ranch. This was about something bigger, about standing up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. As the raiders closed in, Ryder felt his heart race. He had no choice now but to face them. The desert, once his quiet home, was now the battleground for a fight he hadn't asked for but couldn't avoid. The Sithorians moved quickly, their bodies fluid and purposeful as they prepared for battle. Ryder stayed behind them, his rifle in hand, but unsure of what role he would play in the coming fight. As the raiders drew nearer, Ryder's mind raced. He had no idea what would happen next. But one thing was certain. The desert would never be the same again. The Sithorians had come for honor, and they would make sure it was preserved, no matter the cost. The desert sky was darkening quickly, and the wind seemed to pick up with each passing minute. Ryder could feel the weight of the approaching danger in his chest, as though the very air was thick with tension. His heart raced, and his grip tightened around the rifle in his hands. He had never been a fighter, never even imagined being in a situation like this. But the raiders were coming, and there was no escaping what was about to unfold. The Sithorians were ready. Their faces were calm, their eyes focused, their movements deliberate as they lined up, preparing for the coming battle. Dahar stood at the front, his large form a shadow in the twilight, his voice firm and confident. "We stand for honor," he said, his words cutting through the rising winds. "We fight not for vengeance, but for what is right." Now, he was surrounded by a group of fierce warriors, ready to protect him from a group of ruthless raiders. It felt unreal. The world he had known was slipping away, and a new reality was taking shape, one that he wasn't sure he was ready for. The sound of the raiders grew louder as they approached, their horses pounding across the desert ground. They came in a line, their movements wild, their intentions clear. They weren't interested in conversation. They weren't here for a peaceful exchange. They had come to take, to steal, and to destroy. Ryder swallowed hard. He wanted to stay behind the Sithorians, wanted to stay out of the way, but deep down, he knew he couldn't, not anymore. This was his home, his land, and his future. It wasn't just the Sithorians they were fighting for. It was for everything Ryder had built, everything he had worked for. He couldn't stand by while it was torn apart. He looked over at Kara, who was standing close by, her expression tense but calm. She caught his gaze and gave him a small nod, as if she understood his thoughts without him having to say a word. Ryder felt a flicker of resolve. He wasn't in this alone. The Sithorians had come because of him, because of his honor, and now it was time for him to do his part. With a deep breath, Ryder stepped forward, taking his place next to the others. His hands were steady as he held the rifle, but his mind was full of doubt. Would he be able to stand his ground? Would he be able to protect his land, his people? As the raiders closed in, their leader, a tall man with a scar running down his face, shouted out, "We've come for your water, your cattle, and everything you have. Surrender now, and we'll leave you with your life." Ryder's heart thudded in his chest. The raiders had no respect for anyone, no regard for life. They wanted to take what didn't belong to them, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who got in their way. Dahar stepped forward, his voice booming in the growing silence. "We don't surrender. We protect what is ours. You will not take what you have no right to." The raiders laughed, but there was an edge to their laughter, a nervousness beneath their bravado. They knew they were up against more than just a simple rancher and his small herd. They were facing a tribe of fierce warriors, people who valued honor above all else. Ryder could feel the tension in the air, thick like a storm waiting to break. He steadied his rifle, his eyes fixed on the raiders. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what was about to happen, but he couldn't back down now, not when so much was at stake. With a sudden shout, the raiders spurred their horses forward, charging toward the Sithorians. The battle had begun. The sound of hooves pounding the ground was deafening, and Ryder's heart skipped a beat as the raiders barreled toward them. But the Sithorians didn't flinch. They moved in perfect sync, their weapons drawn and their eyes focused. They were ready. Ryder fired his rifle into the air, his shot aimed to distract the raiders, and it worked. One of them veered off course, his horse skittering to the side. Ryder's pulse raced as he watched the chaos unfold around him. The Sithorians fought with fierce precision, each move calculated and deadly. Their swords flashed in the dim light of the evening, cutting through the air with ease. Ryder could see the raiders' confidence start to fade as they realized they were up against more than they could handle. Kara was at Ryder's side, her eyes sharp as she moved quickly, her own weapon ready. She didn't hesitate, her actions smooth and practiced as she fought alongside the Sithorians. Ryder couldn't help but admire her strength, her grace under pressure. She wasn't just surviving. She was thriving in this battle, a force to be reckoned with. The raiders tried to regroup, but they were outmatched. The Sithorians were relentless, pushing them back with every strike, every step. Ryder found himself caught in the heat of the moment, firing his rifle with more confidence, his aim true. He wasn't the soldier the Sithorians were, but he was learning fast, and he wasn't going to let his home fall without a fight. As the battle raged on, Ryder noticed a group of raiders trying to flank the Sithorians from the side. He raised his rifle and fired, taking down one of the attackers. The rest of the raiders hesitated for a moment, unsure of their next move. Dahar's voice rang out over the battlefield, commanding and strong. "We will not yield. We fight for what is right." The raiders faltered. They had underestimated the power of the Sithorians and the strength of their honor. One by one they began to retreat, their will breaking as they realized they were outmatched. The battle had turned, and the Sithorians were victorious. As the dust settled, the sounds of the battle faded, leaving only the heavy breathing of the fighters and the distant howl of the wind. Ryder stood there, his body tense but still, watching as the last of the raiders fled into the desert. The fight was over, but Ryder knew the cost of this victory. It wasn't just the raiders who had been fought. It was the quiet life he had once known, the peace he had taken for granted. Things would never be the same again. Dahar approached him, his face solemn but respectful. "You stood with us, Ryder. You fought for your home and for your honor. You are one of us now." Ryder nodded, though he didn't have the words to respond. He had never asked for this, never wanted to be part of something so much bigger than himself. But the truth was clear now. The desert, with all its isolation and harshness, had brought him to this moment. It had shown him that sometimes the only way to survive was to stand tall, to fight for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. The Sithorians, the raiders, and the desert itself had all played their part, but in the end it was Ryder's honor that had carried him through. As the sun set behind them, the winds quieting, Ryder stood with the Sithorians, no longer a lone rancher but a man who had found his place in a world that had once felt so empty. The price of honor had been high, but in the end it had been worth it.